Today, I'm excited to be joined by Allie Evancho, an expert in the area of nature based practice. She's a practicing therapist in Washington, D.C., and we're going to be diving deeper into this topic, including recent research and actionable takeaways you can implement right away. Welcome to Pediatric Pioneers, a MedBridge podcast where we conquer challenging topics for the pediatric therapist through conversations with pioneers who have blazed new trails in our practice. Our aim is to deliver actionable takeaways for practitioners like you. To receive continuing education credit for this episode and access bonus resources, make sure you check out medbridge.com. Hello, I'm your host, Nicole Quint, and I'm an occupational therapist with over 20 years of experience in practice and academia, specializing in pediatric practice and the improvement of occupational participation and performance through my expertise on executive function, visual perception, social-emotional learning, sleep, and sensory processing. It is my passion to support pediatric therapists like you so that you can best serve the families under your care with evidence-based practice solutions, easy-to-implement advocacy approaches, and new ways to lean into your skills within the challenging pediatric landscape. Welcome, Allie.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm so excited to be here today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. Could you get us started a little bit talking about your interest in nature and occupational therapy and tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So, about 3 years ago, I moved to Washington, D.C. And at the time, so previously I was in North Carolina doing the typical pediatric practice. I was in homes, in schools, in daycares, all over the place. But then when I moved to North Carolina or when I moved to Washington, D.C., my occupational therapy license was delayed. So it was taking a really long time to get approved. I wasn't practicing, and I just felt disconnected from the profession in a way I hadn't been in a while. So I was looking to get involved in the community, meet people in Washington, D.C., stay connected to OT in some way that I could. And I stumbled across a really cool program in Rock Creek Park. So in Washington, D.C., Rock Creek Park is actually twice the size of Central Park, which is like a fun fact, right? And they run this program founded by Maria Stangerlin. They run hikes for kids with disabilities in the park. And I just started as a volunteer. It was just something, to get involved, stay connected. But I really ended up loving it. And at the same time, I was in the PhD program at Nova and I was taking your class and Dr. Block's class. And I had a project where I needed to be an OT consultant with a project. And so I chose to do it with this hiking program. And it really just spiraled into me getting super involved. And now this is my dissertation topic. So it's just kind of grown from there.
I remember that project, Allie. We were in the contextual analysis project in our course that has, the focus on context, environment, and also occupation. And it's really cool to see that that has kind of blown up into this whole focus that you have. And I remember at the time that you were saying that this park is twice as big as Central Park, which is a little mind-boggling. I'm gonna be honest, but I love this topic because we've been talking about play here. We have a play series that we're doing on the podcast, and really thinking about the outdoors, thinking about play, thinking about the affordances that come with taking kids back out into nature that have disabilities or the kids that we see in practice. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about why you think it's important to discuss nature and play within the context of pediatric occupational therapy. And is there anything that we should be reimagining in practice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it is super important to talk about nature in occupational therapy. When I think of us as occupational therapists, we are so creative and there's so many just dynamic opportunities for intervention. And it really makes sense that that would translate well to a space like the outdoors with nature, which is so open ended, so many opportunities for this open ended play, problem solving, collaboration. It just really lends well being outdoors and doing occupational therapy, right? And I also think it's such a sensory rich environment. There's so many opportunities for vestibular input, proprioception, tactile. You can dig in the dirt, bounce on logs, crawl under branches, wade in the creek. There's so many opportunities just for that to naturally occur that I think is really a great area for us as occupational therapists to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I think beyond just the sensory, there's probably a lot of opportunities for various types of regulation,
Definitely.
executive functioning.
Motor planning, all of the good things that we can work on in the outdoors. Absolutely. And I think it's important too to talk about when we talk about nature to also talk about the social justice lens and thinking about how is this environment accessible to marginalized and underserved populations because it's not just about telling people to get outside, right? There it's also is there access? Is there transportation? Is there a cost involved? I mean, I live in the city and there aren't as many green spaces in urban environments, right? A green space is anywhere with vegetation and greenery, forests, gardens. And then there are some, but then you have to pay to enter, right? There's like the fancy rose garden or this garden, right? It's not as accessible as if you live somewhere with a lot of land and in a rural environment.
Well, and it sounds like the activities you're talking about lean more towards an unstructured type of opportunity.
Definitely. And it really lends well to just dynamic play and opportunities for kids to collaborate and problem solve and learn on their own with less demands from the clinician and from me or whoever is with them.
Right. And I know you've talked a little bit when I hear some of the things that you're talking about, this idea of health equity. How does that fit into this idea of going out in nature with the kids?
Yeah, so I think that also brings back talking about the social justice lens. And when we talk about health equity, using the definition of health from the World Health Organization, which is health is a state of complete physical, social, and emotional well being, something that we address definitely as occupational therapists. And then health equity being the fair and just opportunity to live a healthy life. So, how do we as occupational therapists help advocate and implement these opportunities for our populations to live a healthy and meaningful life? And can nature be a tool for that? So, how can we use nature as a tool to improve health equity for these populations?
You're making me think of my own childhood. I was outside all the time. Um, like you were saying, going under things, walking over things, digging in the water, which I love that you brought that up. And, so I have my anecdotal experience of that was so important to me, having a connection with nature. And, I was often with my dog or some of my friends. And I'm wondering, I know it was special, but what does the recent research say? Can you give us some of the highlights of the most important takeaways from what you've looked into on this topic?
Definitely. So there's two areas I want to talk about that kind of go hand in hand. So when we talk about nature, we also have to talk about screen time, right? In this digital age, we kind of can't avoid it. And especially when we're talking about kids, it just is a part of childhood now, really. So when we talk about screen time, we have to look at the consequences of screen time. From the research, we know that the age of exposure for technology. So when children are being first exposed to an iPhone, a tablet, TV, it's decreasing. So they're being exposed at a younger age. And then it's also showing the amount of time they're spending is increasing. So right now, the estimates the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry estimates children ages 8 to 12 spend about 4 to 6 hours on screens a day. And teenagers spend about 9.
Wow. That's more than I was expecting, but I guess I shouldn't have been shocked by that. Wow.
Right, and it goes to think there's only so many hours in the day, right? So if they're spending that much time on devices and screens, they're not spending as much time outside or active moving around, right?
Right.
and we know that this can have consequences. So, the first one I want to talk about is blue light. So, blue light can cause disruption in melatonin production, which is a hormone really important for sleep. And with kids, sleep is so important, right? Because it impacts healthy brain development. And
Mhm.
then, no, second, increased time on screens can lead to a more sedentary lifestyle, right? We're sitting, we're not moving around, we're on our phones, we're scrolling. We know this. And the sedentary lifestyles then can increase our likelihood for diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, and obesity, which unfortunately, a lot of the populations that we work with, like autism, ADHD, they already are at an increased likelihood to develop these conditions. So you add in the screens, and that likelihood is increased even more.
Is there an increased likelihood if they live in the city as well? Does that have an additional effect?
So with screens in with socioeconomic status, it does increase the likelihood for obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular conditions. Yes,
Wow. And
and
then what's
then
the other, yeah, and you said there was another consequence.
yeah. So third is it actually increases your likelihood for developing myopia, which is nearsightedness. So it makes sense when we think about it, right? Specifically, if you're on computer screens, iPhone, all the devices that you're looking at right in front of your face, you're not looking far away and strengthening and using those muscles that you need to look 20, 30 feet away. So, the more time spent on these screens, it's correlating to developing myopia at a younger age. They actually did a study after COVID and looking at kids that spent a lot of time learning online, right, with school. And this cohort of 8 to 12-year-olds, there was a 3 times increase in development of myopia compared to pre-COVID ages kids.
Oh, wow. Well,
Yeah.
I totally can see that because I know doing my dissertation and then I spent a lot of time on the computer for work, my eyesight has gotten consistently worse over time with myopia specifically. So, I could see that. I didn't really think about it with COVID, but that makes sense. So, I can imagine I would assume there's additional concerns for children with disabilities.
Right, because we know that these children are already at risk for developing conditions, and they're spending more time than the same age peers on devices. So a lot of these children, they might already have a more sedentary lifestyle, or they might already be spending a lot more time on the tablet or the phone, so their risk is increased.
Wow, okay. So, what are the benefits of nature according to the research? What do they say?
So there's a lot, right? So the big one is stress reduction. So just spending 5 minutes outside, and that means outside, not on your phone, not talking on the phone, like away from devices completely, just on a walk or even just sitting outside. It'll lower your blood pressure and cortisol. And we know those two things will help with anxiety and depression. And then another big one for our kids is spending time in nature increases creativity and imagination. So we kind of touched on it before, but spending out time outside, there's so many opportunities for open-ended play versus closed play, right? So like if we're doing a puzzle, there's a clear start and finish. There's a clear objective. We know what we need to do. Rather, when we're outside, if they're playing with sticks or rocks or building a house, whatever it might be, it's really up to them and it can take many variations and continue on as long as they let it. So it's very open, which can be great for just developing problem solving.
And then earlier you were talking a little bit about motor coordination and some of the benefits of, moving around and climbing.
Yes. So when kids are outside, they engage in more risky play, right? They're taking chances. They're being, a little bit more adventurous than maybe when we're inside. And this shows greater improvements in motor planning and motor coordination because they're testing their limits, but still in a safe environment.
And, I just spoke with, Dr. Thomas Morgenthaler, and he was talking about risky play, he called it, or adventurous play, and I definitely had not heard that term in a long time, so it's exciting to hear that as we're talking about this group that's at risk, kids with disabilities, so I'm glad that we're bringing that into the fold again. So, I was interested when you were saying earlier about obesity and the connection with sedentary lifestyle and diabetes. This is pretty important. So I wanted to circle back to that and ask you a little bit about what does the research say about this connection?
Yeah, so there's lots of research looking at green spaces and your proximity to green spaces to your risk for developing type 2 diabetes. And they did find individuals who lived in areas with over 40% green spaces. So if you think about that, that has to be a lot of greenery, right? It's
Mhm.
not just living. I'm thinking about my street in Washington D.C. I have to walk pretty far to see a grass patch. So that I don't think that counts as 40%. But where you are maybe in Florida, like, people have yards, there's gardens, there's a park, there's a lot more than 40% green space. So these populations had a significantly lower risk for developing type 2 diabetes.
Huh, that's so interesting. I mean, yeah, it really does matter, and a lot of the kids that we see are living in, a tight city area, so I think that this kind of is something for us to think about the opportunities that we can provide as therapists. So, um, you know, I know that you talk about the theories that you use to drive what you're doing on these DC hikes in the park with the kids. And, I always talk about, OTs, we're really good at using theories. So, what are some of the theories that are driving how you're looking at these opportunities? Because it is unstructured. And
Right.
I think that that's sometimes challenging for us to kind of think about how do we give ourselves structure and letting the kids be unstructured.
Yes, definitely. So, the one I really want to highlight is Kaplan's attention restoration theory. I think this one is really great for nature. So, this theory is all about how nature promotes clarity and restoration, specifically through this concept of soft fascination. So it's all about when we're gazing at nature or anything really, what we're looking at can be considered either soft or hard. So, soft fascination is when we're gazing at things that are not man made, right? So, things in nature like clouds, leaves, the grass, things that are kind of give us a sense of calm almost, compared to contrast that with video games, the TV, bright flashes, things that really promote overstimulation in your brain. So, when we're looking at those things outside through that soft fascination, it actually allows our brain to have cognitive rest. Instead of think about when we're watching a TV show, our brain is still trying to interpret, it's moving a mile a minute, everything is so fast. Then we go outside, we're looking at the clouds, we're looking at the leaves, we can rest. And this is the reason behind those feelings of peace that we see outside. So we're feeling peaceful, we can be introspective, we can reflect because our brain is taking time to just rest.
Sign me up. Whatever it is you're selling, sign me up, right?
Right?
No,
Exactly.
that just makes a lot of sense, and you're making me rethink about I go outside a lot, but I'm often listening to something while I'm doing it, like a podcast or, the news, and maybe I need to just take the headphones away and the earbuds out and just listen to nature a little bit more. Um, I really didn't know about the soft versus hard, and then I know that you talked a little bit about the stress reduction as well,
Yeah,
and that's key.
so auric stress reduction theory also talks about nature viewing and how just gazing at nature can create a subconscious response in our body that lowers cortisol. So just from looking outside, even outside through a window, it will help to lower your stress through the cortisol. And this is really powerful because this says you don't have to be outside for it to have an impact, right? So they did a study even with nurses in a hospital and they had an indoor garden. So they had the nurses on their break go to the garden versus the other nurses had to stay in the inside break room with no greenery. And just viewing that nature, they showed a reduction in burnout symptoms at the end of the study.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and that's something I don't think we even think about. I know I used to work sometimes with kids who were really kind of stuck inside because of their health issues, and sometimes we would put, a door with a window, and have, like, the bird feeder outside so they could see it and, some kind of access, and I think we sometimes underestimate the benefit of that, so I'm glad that you kinda brought that back into the fold. So, um, hearing all this research, and I know there's a ton, how can we translate that research and the theories that you've been talking about into our practice when we work with kids with disabilities in occupational therapy or even in physical therapy and speech language pathology sessions?
Yeah, so the term for this is the nature based interventions or NBIs. And that's when we're taking therapy and we're intentionally doing structured activities in outdoor environments in nature. So at your local park or the forest, somewhere that is immersed in nature. And there's a lot of great people doing things like this. Dr. Laura Park Figueroa is doing a lot of great work. She has a training program if you're interested in becoming trained as a nature based therapist. And then there's also other modalities like mental health therapists are doing this outside. There's a big movement for talk therapy where they go on walks outside while you talk to your therapist, which is fantastic. So, for what I've been doing with the hike program, we are not directly implementing therapy, so it's a little bit different. We are not billing insurances. I'm not doing evaluations or treatment, but it's still all through a therapy lens, right? The mission and kind of the idea behind the program is that these kids that we see are constantly in therapy, constantly being shuffled from OT, speech, PT, whatever it might be, that they don't have any time left to just be a kid and have fun. And also just engage in their community and be a part of something, right? Sometimes they lose that by going to individual therapy each week and then being in the sheltered classes. Where can we provide opportunities for them to be a part of something within the community? So that's kind of been our goal with the hike program.
It's almost like untherapy, right? You're kind of giving them a chance to unwind in nature.
Exactly.
Which I
Exactly.
love that. Yeah. So what populations does this work for? Because 'Cause I'm starting to think about, outside doesn't comply with ADA, right?
Yeah, and that's absolutely something that we run into. I really am of the belief that nature is for everyone and can benefit everyone, and then it becomes our job as the clinician to make it accessible and advocate for these populations that might not be able to access it. So, right now, the populations that we work with mostly are children with disabilities. We have a lot of interest right now for a wheelchair program. So, that's something we've been trying to figure out how to best set up. So we've been working with the park. Rock Creek Park does have designated ADA wheelchair accessible trails, but that doesn't mean they will definitely be accessible to a wheelchair user, right? So we are going to have an actual wheelchair user come out and test them for us before we have the whole group come out.
Oh, that's a great idea. Well, and I love the fact that you're using your OT lens and then you're advocating because we talk a lot about advocacy and how it's our role and how do we do it. And this is a great example of working with the park system and advocating and then using a user to actually do the evaluation for you for accessibility, which is really smart and inclusive, right?
Absolutely. And kind of another thing we've been seeing, another, I guess, unexpected population, because we work primarily with adolescents, sometimes a little bit younger, but they all come via caregiver or parent, right? Somebody drops them off. And during some of the seasons, what we'll see is natural groups form where the caregivers will go on their own hikes. right?
Mhm.
So the parents, the caregivers, whoever dropped off the child for the hike, they kind of stick around, make sure, they get off safely. And then what we've been seeing is each week, then they go off on their hike and get to explore the park with the other caregivers. And I just think this is so powerful because we're seeing these caregivers of children with disabilities who are often isolated, right? They're often in this with not a lot of supports, finding community. And then also, they're getting to experience nature and all the great benefits of nature too. So,
I love that. Yeah, and this is grant funded. You've been getting grants to fund this, correct?
yeah, so that was
Mhm.
part of the outcome from your class is I applied to some grants and we did get funding from DC, which was fantastic. And really this kind of program doesn't require a lot of overhead, right? We have the permits for the park and the business licenses, but outside of that, we've been providing transportation costs. So if because one of the downsides is it's not accessible via metro or, bus. So, providing transportation costs like Uber costs, also materials, binoculars, backpacks, water bottles, fun things like that. But otherwise, it's definitely a program and just an idea that can be really replicated for not a lot of cost.
Right. Yeah, that's the important part is this could be easily replicated. There's all sorts of funding out there, and I like how you said it's low overhead, but some of the fun things that you're gonna use with them. So, um, you know, this is definitely a novel approach. Like I said, it sounds like untherapy, to using our therapeutic lens, and I kinda said earlier, kind of we're giving an unstructured opportunity to the kids or the adolescents, and even the parents, because it sounds like they're getting something out of it. Um, but it's not, it's, we have the structure that we're using with our lens. How are you then selling this to the families? It sounds like you have good turnout. How do we get that buy-in from folks?
Yes, this is something, especially like with grant funding, that meant they didn't have to pay. But we still were trying to figure out how to get people there. That was the first thing. Just getting, I think the biggest barrier is the caregivers will be, they're like, oh, like they can't go hiking or that'll be hard or, they'll they'll elope or this and that, right? There's all these reasons that they might be worried about the child being successful. But once we get the child there one time and we can show the caregiver, show the child that this is something they can do and they can be successful, then we get that they're eager to return. They're just so excited. We had, I'll never forget one parent, one of the first seasons, come up to me after like the third time the hiker had been there. And he told me, he was like, this is the first activity where I pick him up and I don't get a laundry list of the things he needs to work on and the things he's done wrong and all of the negative things. So it's just kind of a bright spot. And, he can feel like a typical kid just going to his hiking club.
Yeah, and that's huge. I mean, I remember hearing so many stories about parents really getting all these negative reports about kids. I even talked about it in my dissertation back in the day. And some of it was really emotionally challenging for parents to navigate. And I even look back on some of the things I said or did in my reports and would love to go back and undo some of them. So I love this opportunity for the parents to hear positive things. They have an outlet to go walk. So there's just so many win-win for everybody kind of situation going on here. So thinking about all of this information and kind of what you've created here, and you've obviously, you're studying this in your dissertation as well. If we're talking maximum impact, and we're talking about shifting some ideas here too, what would be your top three actionable takeaways for therapists to put into practice using nature, outdoor opportunities, and things like that?
Yeah, so number 1, I think, is trying to incorporate green spaces into therapy spaces. And like we talked about, this doesn't have to mean you close your practice and open it at the local park, right? It can be you bring in some plants or you make the clinic room have a window where you can see outside. Even small things like that make a big difference. I know at one of the clinics I used to work in North Carolina, they had a little back patio that opened up to grass. And just taking the kids outside, maybe for one activity in the session, could have huge benefits for the child and also the clinician, right? Like you get some sunshine, you get to be outside and get those good benefits as well. So I think that is really important. I know it can be hard in different settings. So getting creative using our OT lens to try and bring nature inside as much as we can. And then the second one would be looking for to create opportunities for natural community engagement because that's really powerful, right? So sometimes in the waiting rooms or in these spaces at therapy clinics or in the rehab waiting rooms, there's this natural community and they just need a nudge or a push from us to try and connect. How can we get these parents, caregivers, whoever it might be, to form connections to create a community to really help the children, but the caregivers as well, right?
Mhm.
We can all benefit, I think, from a little bit more community. And then the third one is to incorporate green spaces into clinicians' daily routines because we are so important to the therapeutic process. We use therapeutic use of self, right, is one of our strongest tools. So if we're not firing on all cylinders, if we're super stressed and burnt out, we're not going to be able to perform and have the best treatment. So it's important to put time into ourselves and take time for rest and take time to get out into nature so that we can recharge and restore ourselves to be the best therapist we can be too, right? So that could just look like walking in between clients if you have a cancellation or doing your notes outside, getting something getting some nature time in, even if it's small doses, just 5 minutes can make a big impact.
Mhm. And I think taking the kids out there is gonna benefit the therapist as well. I mean, like I said, it's a win-win for everyone. If the parents get involved, you're involved. I can remember you're reminding me, and I wasn't necessarily even understanding the principles of some of these theories that you're talking about. I think at the time I was really thinking about vitamin N, and that was the big movement. And I can remember one of my favorite activities was to do a picnic outside and have the kid I was working with pack what we wanted to take on the picnic for like an executive function kind of thing, and then just go outside and have a picnic. And I used to love that, and I think I was getting a lot of that outdoor time benefit too. We had a nice little courtyard we could go to. But I can even imagine, kind of remember doing outside things with my adults back
Mhm.
in the day too. I had an adult who loved to work with, kind of working on the little trees that you prune and everything, and we would do some of that, and it does make a difference, and I think it's easy to get away from that, so I'm glad that you talked about, like, bringing that back for the therapist too. We need it.
Definitely, and I think too, like, this is something that can be replicated at home, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes, at least when I was in the sensory motor clinic, the parents are like, "Well, I don't have this fancy swing and I don't have all of this equipment. Like, this doesn't look like my house." But then you take them outside and you're like, "Look what we're doing with some sticks and rocks, and we're building an obstacle course, and you can do this in your backyard too," right? So it really simplifies it too for the parent, I think, to say, like, maybe I can take them outside or I can take them for a hike. This is manageable.
Well, I wanna circle back because one of the things that you said that with the buy-in to the families was concerns about safety,
Mhm.
and I totally understand that, and I could see that being one of the reasons why they might not feel comfortable either participating in your, um, program or taking kids out on their own, especially if they're one that's prone to elope. So, how do you address the safety, not only for the buy in, but how are you making it safe for the kids? Because I'm thinking this is a big park in a city where there's a lot of people. How are you making it safe for them and making sure that families understand that?
Yeah, so this is super important. And I think it all goes to the intake process and getting to know the kid before we bring them out into this unknown environment. And a lot of the times, what we'll do on the first hike is we won't even go hiking. We'll stay at the picnic tables and we have kind of a natural boundary of trees. And a lot of the times, what we found is if we don't start on the trails, the kids kind of see that as a boundary. So we stay in this almost picnic grove where they're free to run around in the grass in the picnic tables before we even get to the trails. Because what's most important is connection. So no matter what we're going to do, what activity it is, they have to trust us and we have to be connected for them to want to stay with us, right?
Mhm.
So and I think that works with anything and any child with elopement or any child at all. They don't wanna just go on some hike with a stranger. So we try to spend a lot of time getting to know the hikers so they feel safe and they can feel safe walking and hiking with us once we do start hiking.
Yeah, that makes sense, like, leaning into that therapeutic rapport building that we're really skilled at, so, um, yeah, so then, now that you're kind of explaining how this is a benefit to everybody, there's a lot of research to support, kind of what we're doing, and you've given, your 3 points of what we should be doing more of, our actionable takeaways. um, you know, how can we help those listening, by going through some kind of a scenario to kind of understand the bigger picture and how you actually deliver, this product and this wonderful therapy opportunity that's a little different, to the kids in your area?
Yeah, so I think one of my favorite memories or stories from the program is we took one of the groups one of the first times to the nature center. So there's
Oh.
a lot of really great places in Rock Creek Park and in a lot of parks, right, to explore. There's stables, they have a creek, they have the nature center. And what's kind of neat about Rock Creek Park is it's run by the National Park Rangers because DC is not a state. So we have all our parks are national parks. And so we had the big group, it was like 15 kids, 15 hikers go into the nature center for the first time where they had some different animals there, they had different exhibits, they have a planetarium, and the kids just flocked the desk. They were eager to ask a million questions. You can picture the scene, right? There's all talking over each other. They're so excited. And the 2 rangers just looked so overwhelmed. The kids were asking if they could take the turtle out of the cage. There was a turtle and they wanted to hold it. And the ranger was like, "No, don't touch the turtle, please. No, no." And just so overwhelmed. And then flash forward to now when we go into the nature center, we know a lot of their names, they know our names, they know the kids' names. They'll go get Stumpy the turtle, that's his name, and they'll bring him out. The last time we went, they even put him on the floor so the kids could see him walking around. They let the kids hold the turtle. So, I think it just shows how without direct intervention, just bringing the kids out into their community, because this is their community, and we let them engage and be a part of it, and that the other members of the community see them out there, it really just makes the entire community stronger as a result, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking about this, and it's just what we talk about all the time about repeated exposure to people that you don't normally have exposure to, and positive interactions opens up so many opportunities. And that's what I hear in that story, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, we're we're normalizing. They are a part of their community, and they deserve to be there, and they can be there, and the park rangers, as a result, have learned. They're becoming even better park rangers, right? Because they
Right.
can educate, and they can interact with them as well.
Yeah, and they're empowered now to when they interact with other families that aren't with your group, they're going to feel more comfortable in those interactions and able to do their job with the community no matter how the community shows up, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's a advocacy piece in OT that I think is often maybe forgotten or overlooked because sometimes we're so zeroed in on the kid that we're working with, or we're zeroed in on the barrier, right? And the thing about barriers is that when we use that word barrier, I always think it sounds almost impossible to kind of move it. So I always say it's a challenge, but I think sometimes we get caught up in the challenge and we don't think like, "Oh, you know what? If we just kind of did this thing, it could open up so many opportunities, or open up that inclusion, or open up that belonging and community like you were speaking to."
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I love that. That's a great story. So, um, you know, before we wrap things up, we've been talking about all this stuff, and I love that there was a story about a turtle because I love turtles. Whenever there can be a turtle involved, I'm excited. What do you think is the next frontier in pediatric therapy that our listeners should be on the lookout for when we're talking about exposing the kids that we work with to nature, outdoor play, and even untherapy, if you will?
Yeah, so I think absolutely working on creating accessible green spaces and just making them available to everybody, making them accessible via transportation, accessible via cost, accessible via wheelchair users, all of that. And then a frontier that I have been super interested in and reading a lot about is the neuroscience and brain body connection with Kelly Mahler. I just think she's wonderful. So that's something I've been on the lookout for too.
Mhm. Is that something that you're incorporating into the hikes?
Absolutely, and I think there's so many opportunities with your senses to just slow down all the mindfulness opportunities when they're out in nature to experience the tactile, the proprioceptive. So it goes really well with interoception to connect their brain and their body and understand a little bit more about their senses too.
Mhm. And then I know you kind of lean into the idea of neurodiversity affirming care, on these hikes as well?
Yes. So with neurodiversity affirming care, we are incorporating it into all of the hikes. We include everybody with disabilities and we want to affirm who they are and their disability if they like to talk about it. So that's something that we try to incorporate.
Kind of, we just spoke with Sharon Eva about some play approaches using that. So I love that we're now talking about that here with the outdoors, and remembering that there's lots of affordances and things outdoors that can reaffirm um, that approach as well, and that everyone is here, neurodiversity, they're going to interact with nature the way that they're going to interact. And it has all those opportunities for the sensory connections as well. So, you were just talking about the accessibility, and I do want to ask you a couple questions about that because I do think it's important. What are some of the things that you do recommend to make the green spaces accessible when you're working with clients in this kind of situation?
I think it goes back to one, advocating. So when we are looking at grants, we're trying to use that money to make it as accessible to underserved and marginalized populations as we can, right? Because one of the things we did was we hired a translator and we were making sure it was accessible to Spanish speakers as well, because there's a large population here in Washington, D.C. So just their programming could be accessible. And then transportation, helping them afford Ubers, so we were paying for the Ubers to get them there because in DC, if something's not metro accessible or bus accessible, a lot of people aren't going to go because most people don't have cars here. And making sure that there's no cost barrier. So if there's a pay fee for to get into green spaces, then a lot of people aren't going to be able to go. So, making it more accessible that way is really important, as well as making sure you are familiar with the area and the space. So, you're aware if there are any barriers or anything that you need to kind of change. Something we like to incorporate is social stories so that the kids are aware of all the different things we're going to like run into on the hikes. A lot of the times we might go to the horse stable. So learning about safety with horses, right? Learning about the nature center and all of those things are important too.
Mhm. And, I think it's exciting how you're using your clinical reasoning to look at that accessibility for the families and making sure that the people that normally would not be able to access some of this are able to. And I think, when you were talking, I'm like, well, in South Florida, we don't have any kind of really effective bus system or metro. Um, but the idea of using the Ubers and everything would be helpful for a lot of families that might have some transportation constraints. So that's something that I might not have thought about. So I think that's probably helpful for people to hear about really keeping that cost as low as possible for the accessibility. So on that note, before we part ways, I do want to ask you: do you have any suggestions for anybody who's working to get a grant? Because I think that can be intimidating to folks. But a lot of people listening might want to start something small and might be thinking about it getting a grant, but they're not really sure how to do that.
Yeah. So it definitely was, a new process for me too. I think using a lot of our occupational therapy knowledge can be helpful when we are filling out part of the grant information. But when you're on the lookout for grants, looking at your local organizations and smaller grants can be really helpful. There's different websites that, like with me, I was looking specifically in DC. So
Mm.
then you're not competing with national organizations, right? So you look at your smaller organizations, you can look at your parks department, they have a lot of stuff too. And thinking about outcomes is really important and how it's going to benefit the city or whatever organization that is giving you the money. So we were talking a lot in our grant about how we were trying to make this park more accessible to populations that can't reach it. So that was beneficial to the city too because they wanted people to take advantage of the parks. So kind of trying to tie in all the different stakeholders and how to make everybody happy, but also ultimately improving that population, your patients' health and well-being.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice because that grant form can be intimidating, but small grants are a great way to start. So thank you for sharing that advice. I really do appreciate it. So that's all the time that we have for today. I want to send out a thank you again to Allie Evancho for the insight and clinical takeaways related to nature and occupational therapy and all that she's doing with her DC hikes. Thanks so much, Allie.
Nicole.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Pediatric Pioneers by MedBridge. Please be sure to subscribe and listen to more of our episodes on Spotify or on your favorite podcast platform and at medbridge.com. If you're listening outside of the MedBridge catalog and would like to access the bonus resources and receive continuing education credit, simply log into your MedBridge account and complete the quiz for this episode. Pediatric Pioneers also listens to you. If there is a particular practitioner that you'd like to hear from, or if you have a question or challenge that you'd like to explore on this podcast, please let us know by leaving a comment on our Instagram post or by emailing podcasts@medbridge.com.